Well, the old song goes, it's always 5 o'clock somewhere, and here it's 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Happy hour time. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast.com studio. Hope you've had a good week so far. We're getting ready to head into the weekend, and of course, that means it's time for our happy hour webcast. We have a fun one coming up today. I'll be joined in just a couple of minutes by Clay Risen of the New York Times and Nino Marchetti of the Whiskey Wash. Don't forget to join us this weekend for the next episode of the WhiskyCast podcast. We have distilleries starting to open up the doors slowly in Scotland right now after lockdowns. And I'll be talking with Julie Trevisan-Hunter of the Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh, just outside of Edinburgh Castle at the top of the Royal Mile. She was on a conference call with visitor center managers from all over Scotland on Thursday. And I got in touch with her right after that, and we'll be talking about that conversation and where the Scotch Whisky Tourism business stands right now as we get into the fun and games of the whiskey world in the post-COVID environment. Let's bring our guests in now. Nino Marchetti from the Whiskey Wash, Clay Risen of the New York Times. Gentlemen, how are you doing today?
Doing all right, sir. Yourself?
Doing great. Let's start off with what you guys have in your glasses. Clay, we'll start with you.
I have the new Wild Turkey 17-year-old bottle and bond. Delicious stuff. As you can see, I've not been skimpy on the pours, but I love it. I love the series, and was really excited to get this one.
And the Angels must be very greedy where you are because there's a lot of evaporation out of that bottle, right?
Yeah. I'm up in Maine, and I'd like to say that was the case, but the Angels aren't the only greedy ones.
The moose too, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's the moose.
Nino, what's in your glass?
All right, so I'm out of Portland, Oregon, so I'm drinking a local product, Bull Run Distillery. This is their straight bourbon whiskey that's finished in a cognac cask. And it's just really rich and flavorful and beautiful color. And the guy that works at the particular distillery does some real magic with bourbon and single malt. And I'm just digging it.
Very cool. I have poured something. I like to pull bottles off the shelf I haven't tasted in a bit. This one is the William Grant and Sons Rare Cask Reserves Anisac 25-year-old. This was a blended malt that was bottled for Reserve 101 at the Whiskey Bar down in Houston. Our buddy Mike Raymond owns the place down there and kindly shared a bottle of this with me a couple of years ago, and saw it on the shelf and thought, you know what, I haven't opened that in a few months. Let's pop that one. So Sláinte, guys, thank you for joining us.
Sláinte, thanks for having us.
Of course, you can always submit your comments in the chat rooms if you're watching at home on Facebook or on YouTube, as well as on Periscope. If you're watching on Twitter, don't respond to the tweet with our live stream in it because we won't see that until after the show. But if you're on Periscope, go ahead and give us your comments, questions, as well as on Facebook and YouTube, and we will pose them from our guests. And I think Chris Ratcliffe is probably already asking what I'm enjoying this in. This is the Tua glass from Ireland that has a uniquely triangular shaped base, which means that you can actually put it like that and not spill.
Nice.
And of course, it was really stupid for me to do that, holding it right over my laptop, just in case I was wrong.
You're living on the edge.
Just be careful. Sparks flying. It's a lot of good whiskey behind you. I'd hate to see,
Well, yeah, that would be the fire that goes up. But let's start off talking about the events of this week. First of all, I think a lot of people went crazy with this announcement about Johnny Walker and the wood or paper bottle, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And everybody kept forgetting the key element in the news release was this is a test, right? They're only going to be testing this with Black Label. What do you guys think of this one?
I don't know. I'm eager to see it. I'm not much of a material scientist, so I don't know if someone tells me that they can make a bottle out of paper. I assume that the interior surface will not be paper. That there's obviously some coating. But as someone who likes to collect bottles, like empty bottles, I hope this doesn't become a dominant thing in the industry. But certainly for something that's like a pretty widely, high volume, not particularly collectible expression, like, sure, that sounds cool.
I wrote about sustainability stuff for a while before I came into the whiskey space, so it's interesting to see how Diageo is positioning it in that kind of regard. I don't know. I'll be curious to see like what the product tastes like coming out of those bottles. Does it have a kind of a weird, funky interaction with it that makes that Johnny Walker not taste like what people are so used to, drinking it straight or as a cocktail?
I think it's interesting because we've also been raising the question of sustainability. That's a hard word to say on a Friday afternoon over the last few months. And one of the things I've been wondering is whether there is a future for glass bottles or what we look at as an alternative. And I can see this being a very viable alternative for the on-premise market, for bars, for instance, that might go through 3 or 4 bottles of Johnny Walker Black Label in a week. If you can reduce the amount of waste and the amount of glass you're using for those bottles and ship it to the on-premise accounts in these recyclable, reusable, sustainable bottles, that's less glass that's going to landfills or recycling that we have to deal with. And I think that's an option for the on-premise market while keeping glass bottle for the more collectible whiskeys and the stuff that you would sell at retail. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, why not?
I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that Diageo is also holds an interest in Pulpex, the company that's making these, and I think they're using this with Johnny Walker some other folks have mentioned this on social media. This may be more to promote it to the folks like PepsiCo and Unilever, the big consumer products groups that are in the non-alcohol space, as a way to get them into this. Argument is if it holds scotch, it'll certainly hold carbonated beverages or juice or whatever else you want to put into it. So that may be the trial balloon they're floating with Johnny Walker here.
That makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
Good thought. Yeah.
Let's move on. We saw distilleries opening up this week. Glenmurray, Glenfiddich, both opened their visitor centers for the first time since the UK had its lockdowns, and especially in Scotland where they locked down earlier. And we are seeing more distilleries starting to open up. Kilhoman opened up the other day as well on Islay, which I think is the first of the Islay distilleries to reopen. Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh will open up August 17th. How big an impact do you think we're going to be seeing in the whiskey industry, especially in Scotland, from all this lost tourism, given what everybody's been putting into tourism and as an investment in whiskey these days?
I mean, we saw Edrington just laid off a bunch of people in Macallan. I think that was largely driven by partly driven by a downturn in tourism and all that investment they put into their new visitors center. This is not a convenient time for them. But I don't know. In the long run, I can't imagine it has any kind of game-changing impact. Scotch tourism is so powerful, and it's a pretty large industry, and it's one that was growing fast. And I just can't imagine that that's going to knock anyone off of kind of a long-term interest in going to Scotland. It seems like, the key is just getting enough distilleries together where, you don't want to go all the way to Elgin just so you can go to Glenmurray and Glenfiddich. You want to be able to go to, a few others. So It seems like, for now that those places are probably going to struggle until they get enough of a critical mass of nearby distilleries that are also open.
Looking at this, I think in the short term, it's going to be hard for the distilleries. People have not been doing significant traveling outside of their country or region for months, given the COVID restrictions. And now that the distilleries are opening back up, I think a lot of people are still on the cautious side. They want to travel. And I think that you're also going to be seeing restrictions in how many people can be in these tasting rooms and how many people can be on tours, and certain tours are canceled and a whole bunch of things. So from an economic recovery perspective, it's great to see the tour stuff coming back, but I think it's going to be a real uphill pushing the boulder in bare feet kind of thing, that it's just going to take a long time to get back to some sense of normalcy. And in the long term, we don't know, right? If there's more COVID surges in certain areas shut down again, will they want to reopen a second time? I don't know, it's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, Kentucky's already starting to see an increase in cases again, and we saw Governor Beshear start ordering masks last week, and then local court striking that down. If we get a lot of traffic along the Bourbon Trail and then cases start to spike, I think you're going to see a real big problem until we have a vaccine at some point, because the distilleries can't afford just to keep closing and reopening their visitor centers every couple of 3 months. It's just not going to make any economic sense to do so. When do you think you guys might feel comfortable going back to a distillery?
Well, I know, because I'm already planning. I'm planning to go out to Kentucky at the end of August, and I've already lined up a week's worth of visits. At the moment, most everybody is at least open to the idea of me coming to visit. Everything is penciled in. Obviously, who knows what changes in the next couple of weeks. I will say, for me personally, I actually had a really mild case of COVID, and as a result, I have a full battery of antibodies. For what it's worth, obviously that's not, the jury's kind of out on what the antibodies mean, but it makes me a little more comfortable with the idea of doing a distillery visit. Now, what I would say is the kind of visit that I will do, I'm a little more looking to go interview people and talk with them. It's not so important to me that I walk around and see every still in the same way that, let's say, a conventional visitor would, and, get into those tight spaces in between the barrels. And so, if I were in that situation, I might feel a little differently. I should add that caveat, but yeah, I mean, I'm going to give it a whirl.
I'm looking forward to getting back to some of these distilleries as well. For me, it's just like making sure that those guidelines of social distancing, mask wearing, etc., are being upheld. I think that's the thing. You hear in certain places they're being enforced and considered. In other places, it's like, hey, let's all be 6 inches from one another and throwing shots back and, partying down like it was last year, when it's not last year. We don't even know what the new normal is yet. So I guess I'm looking forward to it, but I'm cautious as well with seeing what people do to make sure they're enforcing things properly.
And what our fellow citizens are going to be doing as far as giving those of us who choose to wear masks regularly grief about it. Living here in New Jersey, I haven't had that happen yet because everybody's been pretty good about it. But going back out into the Midwest and driving out to Kentucky, which I'll be doing in the next few weeks as well at some point, just for a quick trip, I'm not looking forward to walking into certain rest stops on the highway on the interstate and all of a sudden being looked at weirdly for wearing a mask.
It's amazing how that, politicized doesn't even begin to describe the divided sentiments on what is, a pretty clear. You talk to any doctor, any scientist, epidemiologist, this is the number one, the beginning and the ending of what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that there are people who are angry personally. You can be angry. Like, I don't like wearing a mask, but I do it, and I understand why. And the idea that someone would take it personally is what really, some of these stories you hear about people getting beaten because they're wearing masks is, that's insane to me. You don't have to like it, and you don't have to do it even. But the idea that you're somehow offended by someone else wearing a mask is beyond me.
Yep. And for the record,
oh, yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
One, I showed this off earlier this week. My daughter
That's a nice one.
this for me with the
That's
Glen
pretty awesome.
fabric.
Where'd you get it?
We found this fabric on spoonflower.com.
Spoonflower. Oh, that's great.
And I posted a link for it on our social media feeds, and everybody has been asking where they could, if we're going to sell these. And no, we're not going to sell them because we're not mask makers. don't want her spending all her free time sewing. And 2, I don't want the liability if somebody buys one of these and still gets COVID, because we're not professionals at this, at making PPE. I don't want somebody suing my ass for not making a mask that didn't keep them from getting COVID. And in this country, somebody would do that.
Oh, yeah.
I watched a video earlier this week. It was 2, we'll call them surfboard activists, guys who love to surf and are activist-focused causes. And they are in LA County. And they took a box of free masks down to Orange County, which is notoriously conservative in some areas in Southern California. And they were on the beach just trying to give people masks. And they were like, hey, man, take our mask. It's free. Make a difference. Da, 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 da. Some people took their masks, but a lot of people, the responses that they got were pretty brutal. They even joked at the end of the video that they should have been wearing sneakers instead of sandals, because 1 or 2 people basically physically threatened them. And it's just like, what's going on when we get to the point where I'm like, I'm going to beat you because you're wearing a piece of cloth over your face, trying to just do some social good and, do some protection of other people. It's pretty staggering to me where the discourse has gone on this particular topic. Especially
because the whole idea of the mask is not to protect me from you. If I'm wearing the mask, it's to protect you from me, from anything I'm breathing or sneezing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I can think there's a couple of great analogies that are not safe for work that have gone around in terms of games. And you probably can gather what they are, but I'm not going to go into them. I love this line from Chris Ratcliffe. I'm waiting for a distillery to post, our whiskey isn't filtered, but our customers are. Great line from Bill Ricker. An ER doctor, a nurse, and an epidemiologist walk into a bar. The whole joke is, of course, they don't. Ricker likes his dad jokes. Christopher Whalen usually is up near you in Vermont, not going to Kentucky this year because of COVID, already making plans for next year, though.
Yeah. I mean, I know everyone is just, man, that day when everything is clear, what's that going to be like? But I mean, my concern is that obviously that's a long way off, right? But also, we're having this fight now over masks and, we're and social distancing, and, we'll see, we're seeing the spike again. What happens when there's a vaccine and no one wants to take it? Are you talking about
the whole anti-vaxxer thing?
Well, anti-vaxxer, but also, even people who just, I mean, if there's a number of people out there who just fundamentally don't think this is a big deal, you don't have to be an anti-vaxxer to say, I just don't, I'm not going to take a vaccine for something I don't think is a problem. And, especially if it continues to be politicized, wouldn't it be ironic if we spend all this time working on a vaccine and then turn around and not enough people will take it?
That's true.
Anyway, hopefully not. Hopefully that'll be a pretty easy thing, and we'll get enough people to do it that there's a kind of herd immunity. But who knows these days?
Yeah, let's get on to something happy.
Yeah. I'm drinking whiskey.
Comment from Christopher Whalen. Clay, your book, Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye, is his go-to reference. Plans for a new edition of that one. You've got a new book coming out this October.
I do.
Any plans for the new edition on Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye, or you're going to let, and then we'll talk about the new book?
Yeah, so that's a funny thing, and I get this question a lot because while that book is not outdated, it does need updating. It's a couple of years old, and a lot has changed. The problem is, and I hesitate to say this out loud because I don't want to dissuade people from buying it, but the book is selling well enough that my publisher doesn't see the need for a new edition, right? The publisher says, well, look, it'd take X amount of money to invest in a new edition, and we're doing fine with this one, so why do another one? And, I try to explain, and look, my publisher's great, I'm not ragging on them, but I try to explain that, there's a lot to be said. There's a lot of new stuff. But they're looking at numbers and they're looking at sales, and they say, well, it's we'll see. When the sales drop low enough, we'll talk about an update. So please keep buying it. But if you don't, I'd love that opportunity as well, because I really do want to do a new one. I mean, the other thing is, it was, believe it or not, really easy to do the first edition of that book when there were a relatively small number of distilleries in this country. That was, the first book was 2013. Today it would be really hard. And there were 300 and plus, 323 expressions in that. You couldn't do that book. I mean, there's not 323 expressions. I mean, there are probably 3,000 expressions. So the approach in the book would have to be different as well. I don't think it would be comprehensive in the same way. Now, I am working on, in that series, I am working on a book specifically about American rye whiskey. So that one, the COVID has shut down our tasting panel for the last several months. So it's kind of on hold. But that book is in the works. And it'll be the same kind of shape and size and basic format, but very specifically about rye. And then I have a book coming out this fall that is, it's from, there it is, The Impossible Collection of Whiskey. And if it looks like that's a wood box, it is a wood box. Aceline is the publisher. And if anyone knows their books, they publish these big, beautiful books on everything from, fashion, and they've done cigars and wine. And they have a series, The Impossible Collection. And it was a lot of fun to work on. Basically, they asked me to come up with my list of 100 dream bottles from across the world. Obviously with a good amount of Scotch and a good amount of American, but there's a good amount of Japanese. There's some outliers in there that are a lot of fun. But coming up with the short list of like 50 whiskeys was pretty easy. And then after that, the list grew. I had 200 and then 150, and that last 50, like trimming it from 150 down to 100, and then 110 to 100 was incredibly hard. How do you, which Macallans are you going to include? How do you choose? Is it anyway? Which Kurosawas do you include? Like it's that sort of almost arbitrary. What goes on and what goes off, but it was a lot of fun to work on. And because I didn't design the book, I can say this: they did a beautiful job with it. It's a lovely, lovely product. The photos they sourced were fantastic. The label shots were great. So yeah, I hope it'll come out in October, and I hope people will buy it.
I'm going to watch the vein pop out on your forehead with this next question, Clay. From Whiskey Jason, why should I buy a whiskey book with all the free online information about whiskey?
Hey, it's a good question. So I would say, if I put on I'm going to set aside all modesty and, become a salesman. I think I have something to say about what whiskeys taste good, what whiskeys are interesting. And that stuff is not online. My views, they're in my books. So hopefully people will want to buy them based on that. There's a lot of great information out there. Nino's Whiskey Wash is great. There's also a lot of terrible information out there. And so as a writer, as a journalist, an editor, part of my skill set is really pulling out what is correct information, what's valuable information, and putting that together in a very easily readable, digestible, useful format. So it's the same pitch for almost any book. Why buy a history book? Why buy a biography of George Washington when you can read the rather extensive Wikipedia entry on him? You buy it because Ron Chernow is a fantastic writer and has really spent a lot of time with George Washington and knows his story. And I'm no Ron Chernow, but I'd like to think that I follow basically the same approach to presenting information. So I don't know, that's my pitch. And now I'll put my modesty cap back on and say, thanks.
I would add as well that sometimes just when you've got a glass in your hand and you're kicking back in a favorite chair, I'd rather have a book in my hand versus my iPhone or my laptop or whatever. I'm an analog to digital generation, being Gen X. And there are just times where I prefer a book versus looking at a little screen to read, 18 font text.
100%.
And when you have a classic like one of the Michael Jackson books in your hand, that tactile feeling, and when you have it, whiskey is a sensory experience to begin with, and just to hold that book in your hand, plus the fact that it's been fact checked, it's been edited. We know that 90% of the stuff that's in there, some of it's going to be out of date as soon as you go to the press, but when there's a book there and an author or creative person has taken the time to go through and really tell a story, not everybody can tell a good story. A lot of people can write down a lot of information. That doesn't make them storytellers.
Yeah, well said, Mark.
Nino, for folks who are not familiar with the Whiskey Wash, tell us about the Whiskey Wash. You started this as a hobby, and now it's become a full-time gig, right?
Pretty much. I started it about 6.5 years ago. Was just looking for other things to write about besides sustainability and general consumer tech. And I loved whiskey, and I figured, let's write a little personal blog about it. And I was getting a decent amount of traffic, and I was like, maybe I can make this a business. And now, as I said, 6.5 years later, it's a full-time gig. I've got over 500,000 unique readers on a monthly basis, and a good number of folks writing different types of stories for me. And, we are pumping out reviews and writing about the whiskey lifestyle and, making a decent living off of it. I can't really complain. And hey, you know what? I get to write about this. So I love what I do. I'm not going to argue.
It's a great website. I mean, I follow you guys religiously and learn that's my news source. That's my, I trust your reviews. I get a lot out of a lot of the feature stuff that you do. You really, just a really, a one-stop shop. Very useful.
Thank you. The idea for the site was to write about the topic on a global level, even though we're based here in the US.
Yeah.
I know that there are a lot of whiskey sites out there. Most of them write like niche with Scotch or Bourbon and all those things, and that's fine. But I feel like as whiskey is a global community, so are we. Let's write about the topic from a global level. So I'm happy to write about some really obscure whiskey that was made, in the northern tip of Sweden or something like that. Because even if only 35 people write about it, hey, I got to nerd about a weird whiskey from, the northern tip of Sweden. So my day's set.
Yeah, I keep telling the PR folks, and especially with certain companies in Scotland that don't like to send out news releases about whiskeys that aren't being released in the U.S. And I've had this argument with them for years now. I tell them this directly, and this is exact quote: if you release a single barrel bottling for a duty-free yurt in Mongolia somewhere, I need to know about it, because chances are we've either got listeners who live in Mongolia or are traveling there on business and are going to want to know about it. And the way the internet is today, don't just restrict it to one country.
Right. And there are ways to get whiskey, legitimately shipped from other places for purchase that, not here in the US, you hitting a site in the UK and you're like, oh, I read about that on this site or that site. That's pretty cool. I want to get that. It's about informing consumers about the whiskey lifestyle, as we call it on this site, and leaving the decision to them as to what they want to do with that information.
And Chris Ratcliffe has a question for you, Nino. What sort of articles get the most traffic? Is it the high profile, unusual stuff like we've been talking about, or pretty much the same across the board?
It varies day to day. Sometimes we'll write about some really high profile whiskey that's been released by, say, Campari, Wild Turkey, what have you. And that'll get a mild amount of traffic, but then we'll write about some obscure whiskey museum in Belgium that's got, the third largest collection in the world, and everyone's all over that. So it really depends day to day. We write a lot of news, and that sees a good amount of traffic, but people also love the in-depth interviews. We typically will do an interview and post a full transcript of it, and people will just sit there and read it because it gives them a real chance to get to know that person that's making the product that's in the bottle in front of them at home or at the bar.
That's the same approach we take here, and I'm glad you're doing it. I wish we had the budget to be able to hire writers at times. We've talked about it, but I don't have that kind of a budget right now, so we just do what we can here. Whiskey Jason thinks your site is a great site, fantastic knowledge, and I second that.
Appreciate that.
There's room out here for everybody because
there is.
Whiskey is still relatively undercovered compared to wine, beer, and other drinks, as well as the food sites. There's plenty of room out there for all of us, and that was that same saying: "A rising tide lifts all boats." So,
and that was the thing when I started the site. One of the reasons that I went towards making it a full-time business was that there wasn't really no one else doing it just purely as an online platform. There were some magazines that were pushing some of their content to their sites, but they were more about driving subscriptions to the magazines, which that's fine. That business model works for them. But I was like, why is no one doing this as a pure online experience? Well, here we are.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Whiskey Canuck says he's late joining today. Hello from Montreal. Hello, Canuck. How are you doing today? What do you think the future is for whiskey journalism in terms of where we stand? Because I know, Clay, you write almost as much about whiskey for the New York Times as you do in your whiskey books and as you write about other stuff these days. For instance, you sort of broke the Uncle Nearest story several years ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was fun. I'm of two minds about it. There are a lot of people, like Nino and several magazines, and there's some real quality stuff out there that wasn't around, say, 6-7 years ago. And there is generally better writing about whiskey than there was. Say when I was working on the first edition of my first book, where you really had to dig to find stuff and just ultimately just do a lot of firsthand reporting and reaching out to people, which is, what you're supposed to do in the first place. So it's not a big deal. But just in terms of that depth of reporting and coverage and all that, it wasn't around. Today it is, but there's also so much noise. And one of the things that I find frustrating, and I know a lot of my friends in the cocktail world find frustrating, is that there's a lot of stuff that I, as a journalist, as a professional journalist, would hesitate to call journalism. There's a lot of pay for play, a lot of access journalism, a lot of journalism that is subsidized either directly or, even worse, kind of indirectly on the sly by companies. And so there's a lot of stuff out there that you can't trust. And it's very frustrating. And, because it, at the end of the day, I'm going to write what I want to write, and I'm going to write it to my standards. But it's frustrating to see some sources that are also getting a lot of play that are just not telling the story straight. I would obviously not include either of you in that. And I think that, the rise of podcasts like yours, Mark, and sites like yours, that's important. But, I'm just not, for me, the jury is still out on where this all goes.
When anybody can publish, it takes some of the uniqueness out of it when anybody can do this stuff, pretty much. I'm not trying to say only a few people should be doing it, but there are standards you got to follow if you want to do this right and do it ethically.
I learned from. Oh, go ahead, Clay.
No, absolutely.
Okay, I learned. When I transitioned I worked in the tech sector for a while, and then took a break from most things, and then went into writing and started working with an old school journalist at a community college down in California. That was where I learned my trade. And, he taught me, he was an old newsroom guy, and taught me a lot of ethics and things to consider around what you put into a story and what to say in certain situations, because we ran the school newspaper, and if we had something that a local deli had written, we always labeled it as advertorial, or, if we were giving an opinion on something, it was labeled as an opinion, and just kind of following those old things. And when you're speaking with people, not being afraid to ask questions, we're doing lifestyle journalism. We're not solving major health issues here, but that doesn't mean we just need to roll over and let whatever happens. There are things to be questioned at times and things to investigate, and readers want that truth. When you look at a bottle label, for example, and things that are on there are confusing, they turn to folks like us to go, why does this not make sense? And then we ask the questions that maybe make the decision makers change their minds on things, and that is the importance of journalism across any field. Specifically whiskey journalism and its future, I don't know. All liquor types are cyclical, and I think we're having a really good moment right now. Some of it, unfortunately, is COVID related, when you've seen bottle sales increase and people asking more questions and doing more research. But who knows 5 years from now what this will look like. So for now, we're doing what we're doing, and we're giving people the information they need, and I'm glad to be one of those folks that can supply it.
Yeah. It's expensive to have standards and to maintain them.
And that was the other thing is just, it's unfortunate that whiskey journalism has come at a time when media generally has really contracted as an industry. So, folks who are committed to doing it right really struggle, because, they're not going on the paid trips, to go see a bunch of Diageo distilleries. They're going on their own to do those trips, or they're not simply recycling whatever, whatever a distillery tells them. I think I look at sites like, like Nino's, like yours, or Noah Rothbaum's project at the Daily Beast. They're, half full section where they cover, not just whiskey, but all kinds of spirits. And, I really hope that I don't know how Noah managed to persuade them to let him do that, but it's great. And he has Lou Bryson, he has his Dave Wondrich, and he has some really great people doing great stuff there. And I really just hope that isn't, that there will be more places like that. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be able to write about spirits for the New York Times. But even for me, it's not my main job. I edit politics. So writing about spirits is really when I have time and when it's kind of convenient for everybody involved. So in my mind, the dream would be at least to have 5 or 6 places out there that are well funded, that have at least a writer, if not multiple writers. Maybe they're a section of a bigger publication, or they're one-off, sort of standalone projects. But that's where and if you have that, then you can have all kinds of other stuff. Like you look at wine writing, and there's a ton of garbage in wine writing. But there's also a critical mass, like a core of really great wine writers, really great wine publications, wine institutes, where you can go and get really good information, really good contextual information, really good reviews, and, basically know what's going on. Whiskey, we're not there yet, but, I hope that we can. I hope that the fact that we're a little later to the dance than, say, wine doesn't preclude that.
And I would speak to that in spirits writing in general. I look across other categories in this greater liquor vertical, and there's not a lot. No. Some people are doing gin blogs, other people are doing tequila sites, but there are very few that are doing sort of really comprehensive writing on the subject as a whole, and it sort of leaves a lot of room for the expansion of those that want to look at doing that if they feel like they want to dive into a certain vertical or verticals in the booze world. And
I think the way that a lot of people end up doing it is kind of through cocktails and bar culture. Like, I think Punch is really great, and I write for Punch, so I'll caveat that. Imbibe magazine, it's fantastic, really great stuff. But again, they're writing about kind of a broader, not just, and with Imbibe, they're writing about coffee, and they're writing about tea, and they're writing about anything you drink. So the actual spirits coverage and then the actual whiskey coverage is tighter. But that's maybe how you have to get into it. I mean, we also have to recognize that as much as we love whiskey, like, we're not that big of a sector. So, you have to be kind of self-aware in that regard. But look, I mean, beer has struggled as well. And I think beer is a little further ahead of spirits. But, how many great beer journalists are there? How many great beer sites are there? Like, there are more, but they're not that many more. So,
and I know there's been, particularly on the print side with beer magazines, the contraction of that space has just been staggering. You've watched most of the major beer magazines just get wiped out, or merge and still get wiped out. You've watched some of the beer sites that were around struggle to keep the lights on, and it's hard. I think it's, what are the factors around that? It's hard to say.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Whiskey Jason asks this: can one really truly be independent, yet still reliant on free samples from the industry and sponsored trips to distilleries and whiskey fairs? I'm going to take this one off the top just because, one, I get free samples. Two, we disclose it. When we take a sponsored trip, if I take a sponsored trip, we disclose it and we tell you that, they paid for this, but they don't get any control over it, including the decision of whether I even do a story out of it. And that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it's always going to be, at least with our ethics here, because we post our ethical standards on the website and anybody can review them. And if you got a problem with it, email me and I'll be glad to debate it with you.
With the Whiskey Wash, when it comes to reviews, regular readers to our site will note there's an editor's note for me, which is pretty much boilerplate at the top of every review, which says, we got this from XYZ. And while we appreciate that, it does not influence the final outcome of the review. And I've had a few brands that will be unnamed that have come to me over the years and complained about this or that after a review has been published. And I've been like, you know what? We had the conversation, or it was implied when you sent me the sample that's just the way it goes. If we give it a score and that's the score, that's it. We're not going to change it.
Yeah. I'm fortunately, I guess I'm constrained by the New York Times, rather, some would say onerous. I actually find it pretty reasonable. I'm just not, I can receive samples, but that's about it. So I'm not allowed to go on trips. I'm not allowed to, I can go to a dinner more or less. But it's fairly tight in terms of what I'm allowed to do, which allows me then to just tell people I can't go. Sorry. But I agree with both of you that the important thing is not where you draw the line as much as it's transparency about what you did to engage with a particular product or, a particular experience. So as long, and leave it to readers to judge. If you say, hey, Diageo paid for this trip and here's what I think, they can assess for themselves whether you gave a fair accounting of that experience or that product, or if they feel like you're on the take. I've certainly, with the two of you, I've never felt that was an issue. But certainly the fact that you both disclose, and I do as well, disclose that this is the story behind what's going on here. I don't think you could, because the other thing is, let's just be honest, practically speaking, you couldn't do it otherwise.
Right.
No one, there's no budget, even at the New York Times. I don't have a budget to buy a ton of whiskey. It is very much, you can't avoid samples. You can't avoid engaging with the industry. So you just have to be very careful.
To go somewhere, you can get a plane ticket.
What's that?
But if you had to get a plane ticket to go,
and certainly if I go on trips, the trips are my employer covers them. So everything is covered, but I'm not out running a huge bar tab every night at the Brandy Library, just chucking down, saying, what are my samples tonight? I'm going to run through a bunch of stuff. That's not how it works.
Let's bring up a good. One of our colleagues is Sergio Floridas at Irish Whiskey Magazine, and I'm assuming Sergio's doing this because it's coming from his account. Do you feel that the need for immediate fulfillment in the digital area has compromised the quality of journalism? Yes. We want it now, we want it fast, and we don't always get it right.
I'll say that, and I've slowed it down a little bit because we're, we shake up the types of content we publish each day. The Whiskey Wash, we have things, we have different types of articles. We have your sort of news/new release pieces. We have our in-depth reviews. We've got our interviews, etc. The thing for all of them is that, particularly the new releases, you see a huge traffic surge on your site when you're one of the first to say, write about the new wild turkey, this, that, or whatever. It's because people are looking for it. They want that information. That being said, sometimes it does become like a bit of a treadmill in the sense that you're like, okay, here's another 3 new bottle releases. Do I need to write about them today in order to see people surging to the site? And I feel sometimes like, no, my readership will be happy to read about it in a few days. So I'll wait. It just depends. If I feel like it's something that needs to be pushed out, then I will. If not, I'll sit on it for a bit. I mean, I've got a couple press releases I'm sitting on right now that are pretty big ones. And I'm just like, I have other things I want to publish today. And part of it's just I think maybe this is, for me, running a small business, what do I feel like publishing today? That becomes part of it.
Clay?
Yeah, I mean, you want to get to a place where you have enough of a reputation where being first is not the most important thing, right? If people look to you as the gold standard for quality information, then someone else may or may not get it, but at the end of the day, people are waiting to hear from you about it. That's kind of the position you want to be in. But look, I agree. It's harder these days. I mean, I'm fortunately not in the breaking news whiskey business. Most of the stuff I write for the Times certainly is sort of feature stuff, or else kind of a quasi investigative sort of stuff, whereas there's sort of drill down into an issue. I'm also lucky in that my audience, the audience at the Times is not a whiskey audience. They're sort of whiskey adjacent. They're curious, and of course, I write an article and it gets out there into the world, and it finds its fans, whether they're Times readers or not. But, I'm writing for a general interest audience. So the kinds of stuff I'm writing, if it's 2 or 3 weeks after news has come out, it's news to my readers. So I'm lucky in that regard. But I totally hear you, Nino. That's got to be a challenge.
Clay, question for you. I mean, you're splitting between politics and whiskey. Given the world we live in right now, there's got to be times where you're just like, I'm just going to shelter under this whiskey article because I can't take another moment of politics today.
I will say I've gotten as far as I have because I do both. And, it's really freeing to be able to, yes. So I'll say this because, what it is. But yesterday I worked all day on editing politics pieces, and then I had a long phone call with Drew Kulsveen from Willet, and it was so liberating. I mean, he's a great guy, so I love talking to him anyway. But it was just so nice to be able to talk about. We were just talking about the history of Willet, just kind of and then kind of what they've got going on. It was sort of a catch-up call, and but it was really nice, and it really just kind of very relaxing. I don't know how he felt about it, but I certainly came away from that feeling really refreshed. Like, there is more to the world than the latest news about the presidential race. It's like, I obviously take that stuff really seriously. It's what I spend an enormous amount of my time on, but I probably couldn't do it if I didn't also know that I had this other little preserve in my brain where I was thinking about something totally different.
Chris Matt has a great question about that, Clay, for you, talking about writing outside the whiskey bubble. our little bubble here that
Yeah.
we're preaching to the choir. What's it like communicating about whiskey to the outside world, to the non-whiskey fandom, and how do your regular readers?
So a lot of the pieces that I so I have to pick and choose my pieces really carefully, right? And so I have to sort of think about what do people in the outside world, outside that bubble, think, and what do they what do they want to know? So for example, the most recent piece I wrote, which afraid to say is not that recent, I wrote a piece about efforts to reform Japanese whiskey rules, right? Because we all know, I think, that Japanese whiskey is this Wild West where you actually can import a bunch of a bunch of Ben Nevis, rebottle it as Nika, and pretend that it's Japanese whiskey, essentially. And so, there are efforts to regulate that. So the appeal for me in that story, the reason why I picked that story was that, first of all, everyone knows about Japanese whiskey these days, right? So you may not be a whiskey fan at all, but you know about Japanese whiskey. And maybe you've heard that, right? So then there's kind of a second layer of people who maybe they know that there's something up with Japanese whiskey. And then kind of the prestige turn with the piece is, but did you know that there's a big conversation around creating rules around Japanese whiskey? So I look for those pieces that kind of operate on different levels where they can bring somebody in. So if you don't know anything about whiskey, you probably basically know about Japanese whiskey as it's popular. Mm-hmm. Then you can kind of bring them in. If you write it correctly, or as I tried to write it correctly, you take those readers and you bring them in, but you also make sure from the very beginning that people who do know this story know that they're going to learn something as well. So I'm trying to really, I guess the short answer to your question is that I try to pick stories that really thread the needle, that are both not so obviously geeky that they're only going to appeal to folks like us, but also stories that do actually tell something, do actually say something that people in the know don't necessarily know anything about, or don't know about. So there's a news element to it. There's something. I'm also lucky in that right now people just, even if they don't care about whiskey, they know that whiskey is cool and interesting. So they're willing to do a lot. They're willing to invest in a story that they might not otherwise, right? So I did a piece about, how are craft distilleries, this is right when COVID set in, and it was, a lot of people were freaked out about it. And it was,
stories. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does this mean for whiskey distilleries? Front and center, like that's a story we care about. Maybe, if you did that about a lot of industries, it's a niche story, but people care about craft whiskey. They care about the idea of craft whiskey. So they're going to read that story and they're going to go with you. I knew that they would go with me on this kind of deep dive into what this all means for what is still a really small industry in America. But because it has this outsized presence, people care.
I think people also take a personal feeling to some distilleries. There are people who really love like their craft distillery down the street, or they love, Woodford Reserve, and anything that happens to that brand or the people that work with that brand, they really pay attention to. So if the master distiller leaves a certain place and goes somewhere else, they want to know why. They want to know who's taking over. How's that going to impact what they're drinking? Will that impact how they visit? There's a real intimacy that people feel, I think, with some of these things. And it may be part of his marketing spin, but a lot of it is just, as you mentioned earlier today, Mark, this is a tangible product that we drink and touch and smell and experience. You go to the distillery, you see what's being done. It's not just something that comes out of a widget factory somewhere in the world. It's truly, a product that brings people a form of happiness and consideration, especially in the times we live in right now.
And it's one of the products that crosses generations, and you build a loyalty to it. The analogy I've made many times over the years is that a lot of people use Crest toothpaste or Tide laundry detergent. But when's the last time you ever lined up to take a tour at the Tide factory, or got the manager at the Crest factory to sign a tube of toothpaste for you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or went to the laundry detergent festival.
I would love to go to a laundry detergent.
That would be fascinating, yes.
That would be weird.
It's one of those things,
Precisely
it's
for
one
that
of the
reason.
products that inspires loyalty and passion like no other consumer product group.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would say that I have found over the years more general interest in things that may once have been kind of beyond the pale of mainstream readers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so these days, I could write a piece for the New York Times just profiling a master distiller, right? 7-8 years ago, probably not, because there just wouldn't have been, not only would there not have been the interest, there wouldn't have been the general understanding, like, what is a master distiller again? What is like, who are these people? These days, you can kind of assume that, like, most people understand that that's a term that means something. And so
editors on a Jimmy Russell profile 6-7 years ago.
Yeah. But if I were to do a profile, like, I'm not planning on this, but maybe I will someday. You know, certainly when a moment comes, I could easily do a profile of Jimmy Russell today for the New York Times. Probably not when I started out.
That's true.
And let me put it in a term that I know none of us want to ever think about. More of a New York Times obituary for someone like Jimmy Russell.
When Dave Pickerel died, I was, I didn't write we have an obits team, so there's no need for me to write it. But the obit writer, he and I sat down and we had a long conversation. He spent a lot of time really investing time in the Dave Pickerel obit for the New York Times, and in fact, when he passed away, when I heard about it, I wrote to the editor of the desk, who's a friend of mine, and I said, Dan, you need to make sure, I don't know, do you want to cover Dave Pickerel? Like, he's a pretty big deal in our world. And he said, don't worry, we're already on it. So, that's where, they're a crackerjack desk, but they already had Dave on their menu. So,
Reporters and whiskey.
What's that?
Reporters and whiskey.
The power of some of these personalities and how many people they touch is staggering. You're talking about Pickerel for a moment. I remember when he passed away, and then all the social media that just lit up around him and what his life was like and what he did for the industry. And then there were just and I went to the one here in Portland. There were just all these gatherings of people all over the country that were celebrating him and raising glasses and drinking Whistle Pig and talking about how he had touched them in one way or another. And that's just not something, again, you're going to get from a toothpaste factory kind of experience. There's just a thing in this world we write about that people really feel drawn to. And it's not just the bottle, but it's the story behind it and the people behind it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great question from Tyrone Cote for you, Nino. Question, he agrees with your rating of Artbeg Wee Beastie. Your review is almost identical to mine, except your spelling and grammar are better. What do you think of Artbeg Black?
I will say I've not had Artbeg Black yet. And the reason why I say that is this, because we take a team approach to reviewing whiskey on the website here. And I assigned that to one of my other reviewers, the review sample that we got. And I have not had that particular bottle yet. So speaking truthfully on that, I believe the Artbeg products in general are solid. My reviewer that reviewed that seemed to like it as well. And, I think Artbeg did a pretty fascinating job with that release this year, given everything that's been going on with COVID and that being, such a signature product for them this particular year. So I give them hats off to that.
What did you, sorry, I missed your review of Wee Beastie. What did you think?
We gave it, I believe, a 3.5 or a 4. I'd have to go back and look at the review. Right. It was solid for what it is. I think the thing that's fascinating about it is it's young Artbeg.
Yeah.
Right. You don't get a chance to taste a lot of young Artbeg. And my reviewer that touched that, she liked it.
Okay. So, I mean, that's about what I would say. So great.
And Bill Ricker points out the exception that proves the rule, the annual Moxie Soda Festival in Maine. Also something.
Yes.
They're having that this year, though, are they? Because of COVID, I would think.
They're not doing anything. I just saw the Savannah Food and Wine Festival is being canceled.
I think every food and wine festival.
I mean, everything's canceled. I wouldn't go to that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, Malt Stock got canceled last week. They announced that.
The Bardstown Bourbon Festival is still on.
Yeah, Kentucky. They moved it to October. As of now.
That's
I might try to go to that. Yeah.
And I'm just waiting to hear. I got to be honest. I don't know how they're going to pull it off, but
I don't know how any of this stuff is. That's it's been one. I've seen so many festival canceled, festival move, festival canceled releases. I'm just like,
yeah, no, I know, but I don't know. I really enjoy that stuff. So it sucks, but what are you gonna do? I mean, like Whiskey Fest. I love going to Whiskey Fest, but I don't. When's the next time anyone's gonna feel comfortable going into that room in Times Square? What, a couple of thousand people packed into that room, sweaty and drunk, and
I'm just waiting to hear about next month. We've got Whiskey and Barrel Night, which used to be Whiskey Live in New York.
Oh, yeah,
August 20th, and as much as I like Dave Sweet and all the guys who put that show on, I'm thinking, I got to really think about that one.
Yeah.
Rich Jankovic, and I hope I'm not butchering that last name. Does anyone have any idea on how much percentage wide of a release is set aside or sent out as samples to the press, with many special releases having a limited number of bottles in the run? What percent is actually making out to the public? Pretty much almost all of it, because if it's that limited, we're going to be lucky if we get little tiny bottles. We're not getting bottles.
The funny thing is, and people think, well, we get samples for every single thing that comes out there, and the answer is no. Actually, we don't. Distilleries with some of the product, you'll be like, hey, we want to review that, and they're like, we don't got any samples to give out. It's all out to the world around us, and that makes sense. I mean, they love our reviews, but the industry as well knows that if they've got something that's a very small batch release, they don't have what is needed to spare to put out for reviews.
Yeah, it seems to me like they're, obviously the big distilleries and distilling, I mean, the big companies, they have strategies, they have teams, they're going to send you stuff. But when you get to the craft level, some engage with a PR team or hire someone, and then that's their job. But the ones that don't, and that, it's perfectly fine, like whatever your strategy is. The ones that don't, they tend not to think in those terms, and they just send it out. And, so, I mean, I feel like if I just took a smattering, if I just took a sort of a cross section, a census of like, what do I get in the mail, and what do I hear from by email? It's random, really.
Yeah.
It's or hit or miss. Most people will, if I, whine and cajole them, they'll send me a little sample. I just need a little sample. But yeah,
this is the newest Bookers that came today, and it depends on the time, and
full-size bottles,
full-size bottles of Bookers. This is the number 2 batch from 2020, the Boston batch. And this is the sample that arrived in the mail yesterday. And that's all I need, frankly, because you look behind here, I already got more than
you don't look like you're
able to drink. And I'm turning it down. But if somebody needs to share this, I'd rather take a small sample of this and just be able to try it, so that more guys and more women and more writers around the industry can have a chance to try it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need a full-size bottle to do a sample tasting on it.
Yeah, and I would say that if I've never been on the other side, so I don't know how it works, but if I hope no one is looking at the question of, do I send out samples and saying, well, we can't afford to send a whole bottle, so let's not send samples at all.
Yeah.
I would much rather get lots of little bottles than, some full-size bottles, but some distilleries just saying, no, we can't afford that. Because like you, Mark, I don't need a whole bottle. I mean, I have money. I can buy my own whiskey.
Yeah.
I just want samples. And, unfortunately, even in New York City, you can't get everything. It's not easy to go out and buy everything around, and you can't. And in New York, they can't ship to us. You can, I mean, retail. You can't ship by retail, so we're constrained. So just as a journalist, I just want the information. I just want the sample.
I love telling the stories of small craft distilleries somewhere that are producing something very unique. Part of that story is reviewing the product.
Yeah.
Right. So like I think about Far North Spirits, for example, way up there in the tip of Minnesota.
I love them.
Those guys, when they first started, no one knew about them, but they were truly like as farm to bottle as you could get.
Yep.
And now they're a little more well known and widely distributed, but reviewing that first bottle that we reviewed from them was amazing because the product was just as good as the story.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of things I love to be able to educate folks about and say, like, look at what these guys are doing way up here. I don't know if you get a bottle of it, but at least know that this kind of ingenuity and innovation is going on in this industry.
Yeah. They have an amazing story. I mean, all that rye whiskey that they're made, working with different varietals and working with the state ag extension, like that's the kind of stuff that distilleries, not every distillery needs to do that, but I love those stories.
Sure.
I think I saw Scott Blackwell posting some comments here somewhere.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think he was on there. Anyway, the stuff they're doing down in Charleston, fantastic. And not just the products, but the research and the work and the stories that come out of it. I think that's to me, that's what gets me excited.
Because we're all three of us and others in our space, reviewing whiskey is a lot of fun. I'm not going to complain about that. But telling stories at the end of the day, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
That's why our readers come to us, our listeners come to us, because they don't want to know, again, just what's in the bottle. They want to know the story behind it, because so much of this is about storytelling. These things have life of their own. People have worked hard to put them together. It's not just like a bottle of Coke sitting on the shelf or something. This has a history and a uniqueness, each bottle to its own. And it's important for us to tell those tales.
Yeah. And I think that's the story. You need to get those stories to give. I mean, part of my, if I can, I don't want to sound like I'm standing on a pedestal, but part of my project, right?
Oh, go ahead.
Is to give that kind of context and richness to spirits that certainly exists with wine, to some extent exists with beer, but I feel like just isn't quite there with whiskey, even though we all know that there's a ton there. So in some sense, it's like low-hanging fruit. Like there's so many stories, there's so much context, there's so much richness, there's so much connective tissue there. That it's not just some distillery somewhere churning out spirit whiskey, but there's actually locally and nationally context around that product, and telling that story, I think is really valuable. Not only I think it helps the industry, obviously, but I think really what it does is it helps firm really explain the place that spirits have in kind of the let's say at least the American context, and always have. I think one of the, I don't know about you, but the thing that, and I've been doing a little writing project on this, so it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'm sure you all have thought about this too. What would it have been like if Prohibition had not happened? We hear a lot about how phylloxera really interrupted French wine and cognac and all that, but Prohibition was so much more than that. And Prohibition just severed and in some ways, reset, completely destroyed so many traditions.
Sure.
And I feel like we are only now starting to engage with spirits in a way that, had Prohibition not happened, we would have done a long time ago. And so the books that are being written now, the websites, the journalists who are out there telling these stories are really playing catch up to a story that should have been told, the richness of a story that should have been out there a long time ago.
And Chris Ratcliffe has this great question. Do small distilleries and bottlers do enough to engage with the press? Are they missing out on coverage? I find they're more aggressive and they work because they know they have to.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to get stories out of the small guys than it is out of the big ones.
It can be at times, yeah.
You don't have 3 layers of PR folks running interference.
I find that, like, we watch local media in different states just through Google to see who's talking about things, because usually coverage of craft distilleries first happens on the local level. And then if it's an interesting story they're telling, we'll engage with that distillery and then tell their story on a larger level.
Yeah.
And that's part of that. I find craft distilleries, small guys tend to be hit or miss on press coverage. Some of them are aggressive, but a lot either just don't know what they need to do for it or they don't have the money for it. But they're still making amazing product and have fascinating tales to tell. And if we get wind of them, if it's worth writing about, then there's your window right there to tell your tale.
Yeah. I agree with you completely. It's hard to know, right? There's so many craft distilleries out there now, and so I hear from a lot of people, but do I hear from enough people? Do I hear from a good cross section? I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like the parable of the drunk looking for his keys under the street light. Like, I only know what I see. I don't actually know what's not out there. So are there great stories that some distilleries simply aren't telling, and because they're so small or local, I never hear about? Perhaps. On the other hand, I do hear from a lot of people. There's a wealth of great stories out there. So hard to say.
You're talking earlier about the history of Prohibition and that kind of thing. I find bourbon archaeology particularly interesting, and seeing some of these people just, walking through the underbrush of rural parts of Kentucky and coming across these old, distillery ruins. And you're like, okay, well, wait, this is the 20th century. Why are you coming across ruins? But that's really what it was. Some of these guys just shut down and literally faded into the trees. Well, and it's like, what was their story? What went on with them?
I mean, hell, until it became Castle. I mean, I remember before it became Castle and Key, like, many times driving by the old Taylor distillery, and that was awesome. And I always went with my brother. We were doing trips up into Kentucky, and I never quite had the guts to jump the fence, and I knew what was inside. Now, of course, Castle and Key has done an amazing job rehabilitating that site. It's beautiful. But yeah, you talk about like a just bourbon, I don't know. It's not bourbon Pompeii because that's at Buffalo Trace, but it is that same analogy of just these ruins and just out in the open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I jumped the fence, and I got caught.
Good man.
I got caught. I was actually talking with Sean Josephs yesterday. He used to own Char No. 4 in Brooklyn, and is now one of the founders of Pinhook Bourbon. We were talking for an interview here on the next week's WhiskyCast, and they're working with Castle and Key now. And I had this discussion with him because he and his friends had jumped the fence a couple of times, and I got caught by the one deputy sheriff that they had tasked with keeping an eye on the place that was being paid by the lot.
No,
at the time I got caught, and he said, "Okay, here's what you got to do. Since you're a journalist, I want you to go across the road from the castle part of the distillery. There's an old cemetery across the road from there, if you've ever seen it. And there's a Revolutionary War soldier buried there who was a sergeant in George Washington's army during the Revolution. Go back there and take a look at that gravestone, and I'll let you off the hook this time. Otherwise, it's like 50 hours of community service and a fine if you get caught for trespassing." And he let me off the hook.
Wow. And what was it about the grave that
he just wanted people to know about it?
Oh, okay.
Because he had been taking care of it and restoring it. This was before they had restored the distillery.
Yeah.
And so the grave was basically...
That's a better story than not getting caught, to be honest. Like, well, good for you.
See, I got caught, but I got some great photos.
Yeah.
Warehouses back there and everything. But one quick question here. I just wanted to... And as people, let's emphasize this because there was discussion about the prohibition issues. People were saying, well, that means you're too focused on the USA. But Billy Abbott, our pal at the Whiskey Exchange, points out,
Yeah.
more than American booze, it affected Ireland, Scotland, Canada, the Caribbean. It affected
No, great
the
point.
entire world
Yeah.
of spirits.
No, that's a great point. And obviously, I think someone else also mentioned Irish whiskey. And I mean, in some ways, Ireland got it worse than we did because, American whiskey in some ways bounced back. Irish whiskey, we all know the long story of what Prohibition did to that country and that distilling tradition, and is only now sort of coming around. But no, absolutely right.
Whiskey Jason just likes to start trouble, I think, at times. I'm trying to pull up the question here. Should there ever be negative reviews? And if so, why? Hell yeah, there should be negative reviews.
Totally.
Yeah.
We have scored whiskeys. We've flipped our format once or twice over the years, but we're on a 0 to 5 scale right now. And I think the lowest we've ever scored a whiskey is half a star because it was just that bad. And we don't have qualms about saying why. The distilleries may not agree with us, but if a whiskey is bad and you send it to us and we find it to be that way, I'm not going to, mince words or make you feel good about it. I mean, you sent the whiskey to us because you wanted a score. We're not going to, kiss and hug you about it if it's not good. We'll give you but
I agree completely. Like we're all big people. We're all adults. Like, if your stuff's not good and you're trying to get consumers to buy it, it's my job as a critic, as a reviewer, to say this is not good, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that. If I think something tastes like wet cardboard, I'm going to say it tastes like wet cardboard because I want people who would otherwise spend $60 on a bottle,
sure.
on a bottle, to know that. I feel like, and someone can disagree. Someone can say, no, actually, I really liked it. And that's great. That's the idea. But, and hopefully all of that becomes, fodder for a consumer to say, well, I trust Clay, or I don't trust Clay, but I trust Nino. Whiskey.
Whiskey?
Yeah. I know. Yes. Yeah.
So you know what we're talking about.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
That was my second lowest scoring whiskey of all time.
But I don't think that anyone has that anyone. I don't think I'm doing anyone a service by holding back.
No.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm not going to go out of my way to demean somebody.
No.
And I will respect someone's efforts. Look, I know it's really hard to make whiskey, and I respect that. And I respect the effort and the money and the blood and the sweat and the tears that someone puts into a product. So I will always try to be respectful of someone's efforts. But at the end of the day, if I don't think it's good, I'm going to say that in the right way.
And Tyrone Cody wants to know, what was the whiskey that got the half a star?
Oh, I would say that, but I don't want to embarrass them on the air.
Oh,
go on the site and look for it. That's all I can say at this point.
I will before we ever gave a whiskey here, that I ever gave a whiskey, was for that monstrosity that the Pabst Blue Ribbon folks came out with last year.
Aged for an hour, or what was it? Like
5 seconds.
5 minutes, right? 5 minutes.
Seconds.
5 seconds, yeah.
They dribbled it over oak staves coming off the still.
Yeah.
I will say we did a few years ago do a roundup of cinnamon flavored whiskeys, and so if you want a good laugh, go read that. So that was a long article for the person who took on that assignment.
That one was even lower than the infamous Westland Inferno, which was the one that they finished in it, or they matured it in a Tabasco cask 4.5 years.
It was an April Fool. The funny thing was, it was an April Fool.
Yeah.
And it actually started out at the distillery, though. People lined up for it.
Yeah, I scored it a 35, and they said, we would have been offended if you'd scored it higher.
Well, those guys are good sports.
They are good sports.
You're not going to get them on the wrong side.
And Whiskey Jason points out, just trying to ask good questions with a smiley face emoji.
Totally.
Yeah, thanks.
Great questions. That's
and
great.
Whiskey points out, that half star that you guys give the whiskey, Nino, was for the bottle not leaking.
It's hard because we do get a lot of whiskey through, I try to discourage white whiskey and flavored whiskey from being sent in. Occasionally, we do get those bottles, and we will review them. Well, we've had a few surprises over the years, but it's hard because running a whiskey site like we do, we want to write about everything. But I also know there are certain things that our readers and reviewers are not going to resonate with. Particularly with flavored whiskey, it's a hard category to make a good quality product out of.
And let's be honest. I mean, there are craft whiskeys that make flavored whiskey that they really take a lot of pride in, but by and large, people who are consuming flavored whiskeys are not. Your review is not going to make a difference one way or the other. If you say this cinnamon whiskey tastes like garbage, they're still going to drink it because they just want cinnamon whiskey. Mm-hmm. And it's just not a category that's very amenable to reviews, right? It's like whenever people, there's a whole category of movies, right, where we know that it doesn't really matter what the critics think. People are going to watch them, and they're fine, and that's fine. Like, that's just what it is. And it's the same thing with some spirits. Like, you don't have to review everything. Some of it's just doesn't fit with the critical consent or the critical examination.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody URS 16875 says, I once had a whiskey tasting of bird poo and mothballs.
What do you know? How do you know what bird poo tastes like?
Yeah, how did you know it tasted like bird poo?
I assume that means you imagine.
Yeah,
like it tastes like what you imagine bird poo tastes like. Totally get it.
Could also be a traumatic childhood experience.
Could be.
Yeah,
could be. Well, there's what's the Irish whiskey? Or not Irish, the Icelandic whiskey that's made with
Loki, the sheepdog.
Yeah, Loki.
Yes, that was.
Yeah, so
it wasn't bad because
it wasn't bad. It was, it wasn't bad. Different.
It was one of those experiences where I was like, I wish this tasted worse. It
would be easier if it tasted worse.
Yeah, because then I would talk about it. Now it's just sort of not. I mean, it wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. I wished it was alternately, I wished it tasted awesome, right? So I could say, you will not believe how awesome this whiskey is, because let me tell you what it's made from.
Oh, I thought it was pretty good, actually. I liked it. I would have bought a bottle. I would have paid good cash for a bottle.
Okay, I'm not sure I would go there, but I, look, I drank it. Yeah. I didn't spit it out. It was fine.
I've spit out a lot worse.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I was far from the worst whiskey I've ever had.
So what is the worst whiskey you guys have ever had? I've already named mine. Which one?
Oh, what was it called?
Loch Dew?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the infamous whiskeys, right? Not technically whiskey, but the aged Absolute that Pernod came out with was like 4 or 5 years ago. Not technically a whiskey, but also, distilled alcohol, alcohol aged in wood. That was terrible. That was bad. So I don't know. Those would be my two.
I love the current team at George Dickel. That being said, George Dickel Tabasco. That was
not them though. That was right. That was
just prior. Yeah, that was brutal. That was just brutal.
Two things I love.
But that was
I love George Dickel and I love Tabasco, but they don't. No, I agree with that. Yeah, that was not good. I mean, look, there's a ton of
Inferno though.
What's that?
It was better than Westland Inferno.
They're close. I tried Inferno because I was up, being here in Portland, Oregon, where we're located. Seattle's just a couple hours up the road, so I had popped up there just to chat with them, and they're like, "Here, try Inferno." I was like, "What's Inferno?" And they poured it. I was like, "I need something to cool my mouth because I feel like my teeth are melting right now." They were laughing. I'm like, "Yeah, well, good April Fool's whiskey, guys. Good job."
Wow. Yeah, Whiskey Canuck just said it mentioned a whiskey with blue cheese notes, and I'm trying to think of which was the worst blue cheese. Like that's an unfortunately common note in terrible craft whiskey, and I'd have to search for a moment to think of which one really jumped out at me. But yeah, I've had that a lot. Oh, another bad one, and because we're being honest and open, and everyone's a big boy. Amador, the first Amador release was really terrible, and the folks at Charbet made it, and I love Charbet so much, but that was disgusting. I'm just hate to say that, but that was not good. Maybe not the worst, but it was not good.
Bobby Childs points out that Dickel Tabasco was good in a Bloody Mary.
I can see it for that, yes.
Yeah.
Bobby also lives in New Orleans too, so we have to forgive that one. And for Whalen toured Dickel last summer, thought the Tabasco whiskey was okay, but didn't buy a bottle.
I would love to know why you thought it was okay straight, if you can put a comment in there.
Yeah, we'll go for that. And Crumpler, which craft distilleries have you tried that their product isn't quite good yet, but has great potential in a couple of years? Pretty much almost probably at least half the craft distilleries out there.
So, yeah, I mean, that was my common experience when I was working on the first edition of my first book. So like 2011, 2012, there were a lot of distilleries. I would say, and what's been wonderful over the last 7 or 8 years is to watch those distilleries really come into their own.
Yeah, sure.
And, and by extension, my feeling, proud of myself, seeing the ones that I flagged start to really do good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at, almost all the ones that are prominent today, they started off making okay stuff that blossomed. Locally for me, Kings County, the early Kings County stuff was okay, but they clearly had a passion and they clearly had a bead on what good whiskey would be like. And, they've just progressively better and better and better. And and that's just, for me, that's such a great storyline with craft whiskey, where you get these distilleries with great potential then becoming, just sort of fulfilling their promise.
Which, you go back to the prohibition thing we were talking about earlier, makes me kind of wonder, like, we'll probably never know because there weren't people making detailed tasting notes back in the old days necessarily, but how many of those guys that started out in that time were like the craft guys of today, in that their initial products were, but as time went along, their stuff actually emerged to be really good, and we'll never know because they're lost in the annals of history.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, who knows? Yeah. That's
Whalen, the guy who pointed out that he tasted, thought the Tabasco was okay at Dickel, admits he had some other samples first, so his tongue was pretty well blown out.
It's stuff like, it's funny because if I'm doing a tasting panel or reviewing for a show, depending on like how the whiskeys are laid out, I prefer to have the stuff that's going to blow my palate out be at the end.
Yeah.
Versus, I did a show a few years ago where they were just figuring out how to set up review stuff, and some of the things that blow your palate out were at the very beginning. And so it takes you have to pause for a while to let things reset and eat some things to kind of neutralize those really flavors. And I love extreme whiskeys, but they have to come in their own bubble versus tasting things just one after the other like that.
Yeah, I don't have stamina with that. With really either high alcohol or heavily peated stuff. Like, for me, it has to come at the end. Otherwise, I'm just like, that'll just blow me out really quickly.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I think we've gone 90 minutes here, and I think we've much exhausted everything we can. Thank you, guys.
Another hour and a half. So
I keep chatting. I've got 3 bottles of whiskey sitting next to me. Not that I, want to drink all of them, but happy to keep chatting some other time.
Well, if we get a couple more questions here in the next few seconds, hint, hint, gang, if you want us to keep going, we can keep going for a few more minutes if we get some more questions. So we've talked about the worst. What's the best whiskey you've had in the last year? I'm not going to ask you your best of all time, obviously. What's the best one you've had in the last year?
That's a hard question.
Wow.
Because it really, like, that's like the question I get when I'm at a bar and people ask what I do, and I tell them, they're like, well, what's your favorite whiskey? I'm like, depends on the day, my mood, the weather, what I'm eating with, what comet's passing overhead. I don't know. I'm going to probably, and this is going to be controversial for some, I'm going to say Garrison Brothers Cowboy Bourbon. And the reason why I say that is because even though it's super high proof, and it kicks you in the teeth, ice or no ice, it's just fascinating to me what they've done and being able to milk out such flavor profiles with that, given the circumstances under which it's aged and the proof at which it's bottled. I find it's a whiskey that holds well to the proof that it comes out with. And because it's such an extreme whiskey, but doesn't taste like it's melting your mouth, I find that to be a really good one.
Wow. God, that is a tough act to follow. I mean, I'll sort of take an easy out and say that I bought a bottle of early 90s Bowmore, or late 80s, early 90s Bowmore, that, blew me away. It was great.
Did it have the FWP in it?
No, it's before that. So okay. Yeah, no, it's pre FWP. And no, the other one, I went to, I got and I can't say exactly the source. I went to the new Michter's facility at the Fort Nelson facility in downtown Louisville, right. And they have a pour your own rye whiskey thing at the back, or maybe it's not always rye, but for me it was rye. And you label the bottle. That was awesome. I'm generally a big fan of Michter's stuff, so didn't take much to sell me on it. But that was really nice. It was just a rich, flavorful rye. I mean, for me, partly because I'm working on a book about rye, but I've just really kind of gone down the rabbit hole on what rye whiskey can do, and the ability to just pull out so many flavors. The really not synthetic, but the sort of synthesis that you can achieve with rye between, the barrel and the grain influence is unmatched, I think, in whiskey. And Michter's really nailed it with that one. So probably that, but man, that is a tough question.
Mm-hmm. I got to admit, probably the best one I've tried in probably the last year were the ones I tried just a couple of weeks ago from the last drop, the 1970 Glenrothes.
Oh, I did not try that. Yeah.
Those were stunning. You could taste the difference because they bottled the 3 casks each individually. And you could pick up on the differences with essentially 4 casks numbered together. There was one missing from that bunch. But it really set apart the cask differences. But I think the lowest score I gave one of those was a 95, and the other 2 were 96s. And those were 3 stunning whiskeys. Here's a good one from Chris Ratcliffe. Favorite bottle you'll reliably find in any liquor or grocery store when you're shopping. If you're looking for a bottle, what do you know you're going to get that you're going to get good whiskey every time?
I mean, for me, I'm a huge fan of Old Grandad 114. To me, that's just, in the intersection of price and quality, it just can't be beat. It's a little harder to find these days than it used to be. But fortunately, the price has not really gone up. So for me, that's pretty stellar. As far as Scotch goes, I mean, I will always go with a Balvenie 12. That to me, it's just, I will give that as a gift. I will keep that at my house. I'll mix with it. I'll drink it neat. Like that's just an easy pick for me. Yeah.
Day sippers for me would probably be Maker's Mark. I think that's just a good, solid, middle of the road whiskey for just kicking back with if I don't feel like getting super fancy in anything. And then also one of the younger Glendronachs, because I really love their approach with the sherry cask aging.
Bill Ricker mentioned Famous Grouse. Absolutely.
Yep.
If I had to pick a blend, Famous Grouse.
Mm.
Yeah.
I will admit to a preference these days for Dewar's 12 or Dewar's 15, along with Famous Grouse. Those are good too. I'm also a big fan of some of the older Chivas Regal blends. I think the blends are underrated compared to what they should be.
Oh. Blends is where it's at these days. There's so much good blend. There's so many good blends out there, and I wish people were doing a little more innovation with blends, because I mean, you look at what Compass Box is doing, and they've been doing it for years. And like Famous Grouse, so Naked Grouse was I thought Naked Grouse was pretty good.
Yeah.
But you know, and Chivas has had their stuff. But you know, Scotch blends, like, you know, that should be where there's a ton of innovation. I'd love to see more innovation in that.
Clay, can I pick your rye whiskey brain for a moment?
Please.
Go for it.
I've switched whiskeys from what I showed you earlier. I'm currently drinking this. It was just something I picked up randomly.
Yeah.
Jefferson Presidential 25-year rye. So I have a few little niche bottles here and there. What have you found in your research on rye about that? I know. It's just, you know.
Jesus. Wow. Just my reaction. Like, that's wow. That's cool.
What have you learned? Have you learned anything about that particular bottle's story in your?
Actually, I don't know much about that. I mean, I know it exists. But that is one that I'm sorry to say I don't know that much about. You know, like Jefferson's an interesting story, right? Because they started off as really this, like, they are bottling old Stitzelweller stuff, and you know, eventually that ran out, and so they had to transition, and you know, they've been very successful with that and iterating and coming up with new identities. But yeah, where that 25-year-old rye fits, I'm not exactly sure.
Mark, anything?
I have not tried that one. I'll show you the one I was tasting the other day that we did the tasting notes for it. The Pinhook.
Oh yeah.
Ride On, which was the first rye out of Castle and Key.
Yes.
So good.
Yeah, I think they are going to regret letting Marianne get away.
Well, yeah, but they've got a good team.
They've got a good team, but I thought this, for a 3-year-old rye, this was excellent.
No, that I'm very excited. I think what they've done at Castle and Key, both in terms of taking advantage of what exists there. You know, they've got that huge concrete rick house that they seem to really understand what the possibilities of using a concrete rick house for aging, what that can mean. That's really exciting. So you've got this existing structure, or this existing physical plant that really offers a lot. And then on top of that, just a great distilling operation, a great kind of just very innovative team. And you see it in Pinhook, but I think over, you know, obviously in coming years, we're going to see a lot more coming out of them. So I'm super excited to see what happens there.
And Richard asks your thoughts on the Willett Estate rye. Yeah.
Wait, which one? Wait,
which one? Yeah, but are there any bad ones yet?
Yeah, no, there's no bad one. So we're talking about their homemade.
Yeah, the stuff they've made.
Talking about their homemade stuff. Yeah, it's freaking fantastic.
Yep.
What can I say? There's nothing bad to say. Willett is a place that has gone from strength to strength. I mean, it's a distillery that started, you know, I mean, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but, you know, there's a distillery that started off as, you know, an independent bottler. Like, that was their identity. And, you know, here they are 8 years into their distilling, and they are just killing it with their you know, on-premise distilling. I mean, it's amazing. And you know, to me, that is, I think Willett represents kind of where Kentucky distilling really should be ultimately. You know, they're more than craft, but they're boutique at the same time, and they're they're so cognizant of where they're located, their terroir, their sort of like the role that they play in the culture of whiskey. I think that they represent I think a sophisticated advance in kind of the identity of Kentucky distilling.
You
know, with Willet Rye, I find it to be a good drinker. I have found the Willet story. I've visited them, toured around, and I agree with your comments, Clay. They're good, solid example of what a craft-ish distillery can be out of Kentucky in particular. But they've got also that history that backs them up. I mean, it's amazing to think about them as sort of being a bit of a craft operation. But then when you're standing in front of their visitor center and you look behind you, and you see those giant warehouses that have been there for so long, you're like, this really is a Kentucky distillery where the future meets the past, right? And products like the Willet Estate Rye showcase that transition from what was to what could be for them.
Totally agree.
Let me bring up an interesting question here, and this didn't come from a listener, but I was prompted by Nino pulling out that bottle of Jefferson's. Clay, you broke the Uncle Nearest story several years ago, and full props to you for that. That was a story that really changed the world of whiskey over the last few years. I'm just curious, and I raised this question last week somewhat with Charlie McLean and Mike Veach. When we were talking about the history of slave trade on whiskey. And I'm wondering if we are due for a reckoning of sorts within the bourbon industry over historical ties to slavery. And Clay, you've written about the civil rights movement in books in the past. And I'm just wondering, because when you've got brands that are named for Jefferson, and even Evan Williams was known to have used slave labor for some of his work in Louisville, and other historic names of the bourbon era. Are we due for some stuff to happen here on this? I know that, for instance, the Woodford Reserves distillery today was operated back in those days by Oscar Pepper and did use slave labor. Are we due for a reckoning within the bourbon industry on coming to terms with that legacy?
I think it's complicated. I think that the legacy is not with slavery because, as we know, the bourbon industry was eviscerated by the Civil War, and most commercial distilling in Kentucky and Tennessee was ended. So there's almost, in the same way that Prohibition ended and, was sort of this extinction event. The Civil War was also an extinction event. So a lot of, there really is no distillery that exists today or really existed after the Civil War in any size that existed before the Civil War. So while there is certainly a legacy that needs to be grappled with, there isn't a direct line. One of the things that was frustrating with this piece, with the first piece I wrote about Uncle Nearest, was people saying, Jack Daniels, the brand, or Brown-Forman, the company that owns them, that whiskey was made by slaves or enslaved people, and that's actually exactly not the point of the piece. It's that Jack Daniel himself never owned slaves. He wasn't old enough to have owned slaves. Rather, he later employed Nearest Green, who had been, had been emancipated, as his master distiller. And in some ways, you take it for what it is, but there's something of a positive story there.
And Jack Daniel himself was an indentured servant to the Reverend Cole.
Yeah, and so it's complicated in that way. But look, I think that doesn't get anybody off the hook because, first of all, obviously there's that legacy. And I think that the history of whiskey, as it's told, needs to grapple more fully with its origins in in an environment that relied very much on enslaved people to do the work, and often to do the skilled work. I mean, someone like Nearest, I mean, one of the things that's very frustrating from a historian's point of view is that we have the story of Nearest Green, and we can only assume that there were lots of people like him, but we don't. One of the things that makes him special is that we do know about him. We don't know about all these other people, but we have hints. We have hints that there were enslaved men who were very skilled distillers, who were employed as whiskey makers. There's also, but I think the real reckoning has to do, or another aspect of that reckoning really has to do with the way that whiskey was marketed in the post-Civil War and even up until relatively recently. I mean, there's a whiskey called Rebel Yell. There's there's all kinds of stuff that was marketed in racist terms to Southerners or to even just to Americans generally, with racist caricatures very much aimed at white consumers. And that, I think, has to be grappled with. And that's something to get over. And then more recently, I think it's only recently that the distilling industry has started to recognize that their consumers are not all white, and that that there are lots of people of color out there who love to drink whiskey and would love the attention of the whiskey industry. And some distilleries are doing better than others in coming around to that, but it is still a grappling with that has to take place. So I think so. The long short answer to a long question, or long answer to a short question, is that yes, there's a reckoning to be done, but it's not quite the same as maybe in some other industries.
Because a lot of the bourbon brands, the oldest bourbon brand we know of that in modern existence is Old Forester, which goes back to the 1870s or so, which is post-Civil War, obviously.
Right.
But you still have the legacy of places like the Woodford Reserve Distillery, which was operating before.
Yeah, and that's right. So I think places like that have to figure out what is their legacy
going on there for 200 years on that site.
Yeah.
So there are historical connections that are going to have to be reckoned with. And when you deal with some of the brand names that people have chosen over the years, like Jefferson's.
Mm-hmm. Well, Evan Williams, like you said,
there's going to have to be some honesty and some self-searching there, really. And I
agree with that.
To explain it and maybe to understand the whole legacy there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think also just the industry has to deal with its overwhelming whiteness. And some places are doing better than others, but it is an industry that really favors people who have access to capital, who have access to certain sort of cultural capital. And, that's a much more complicated question, much more difficult question to reckon with. But it's obviously something that has to happen.
And heredity too, because you had fathers bringing their sons along into the business.
Yeah, sure. No, sure. And that stuff, that's where it gets complicated, right? Because that's also something you want to celebrate. Like, no one should feel bad because their father was a distiller and they're now a distiller, just because they happen to be white. But they should also be cognizant of the fact that what the industry should look like going forward doesn't necessarily look like what it was when their grandfathers were making whiskey. So that's tough to get around. But I am heartened by the fact. It seems to me that those conversations are happening. Whether they're happening fast enough or thoroughly enough is maybe a question to be assessed later. But I do see those questions taking place and those conversations taking place. So, I'm optimistic.
And it's not really a question for us as three middle-aged white guys.
Right. Yeah, right. It's not me to say exactly, but
it needs to move.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I do think that all of us can play a role in helping create space helping engage, as allies in that dialogue. So
the thing is, we also have platforms
Yeah.
to our readership to be able to offer those conversations and those stories to be told. I was chatting with Fawn from Uncle Nearest last week, and we were having some conversations around the topic of race. And, she was saying some things that, had me thinking about, like, there are a lot of people that work at distilleries that are African-American and in high profile roles. Their stories have never been told by those brands for whatever reason. Yet, we trot out certain people and tell their stories and trot them back in. Let's tell the stories of everybody. It's an important conversation to have. I think whiskey should be an inclusive industry, and that's something that's important, particularly in this day and age, to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, we should be telling the stories without regard to what ethnicity a person is. We should be telling them regarding the quality of the whiskey they make. If they're making great whiskey, let's highlight them.
Yeah.
But we also have to acknowledge the fact that we need to highlight those people who are trying to bring about change. When you look at folks like Samara Rivers, the Black Bourbon Society, she's great stuff.
Great
In
stuff.
terms of trying to show the world that, yes, not only is this the right thing to do, but if you do it right, it's also a profitable thing to do, because there's an audience out there that's waiting for whiskey companies to come to them and will buy their product if they're treated properly and if they're treated with respect.
Yeah. It's almost sort of comical that wasn't that hasn't always been obvious, right? Sort of strange.
Yeah, but, and I've said this often on social media, as a collective species, we are pretty damn dumb. Individuals in this species are pretty good, but as a species, we are pretty damn stupid. We're lucky we got to the top of the food chain. Frankly, the sharks and the tigers and the elephants and the lions should have taken care of us a long time ago.
Sometimes our hold on that position is very tenuous.
Yeah, well, certainly these days with COVID, I mean, I'd say the American genus or the American subspecies of that species is not exactly proving otherwise these days.
Yeah, let's not go into politics there, because
Look, I got more whiskey in my glass. All right,
absolutely,
guys. We're in, 2 full hours tonight. This is our longest webcast yet. I want to thank the Horizon of New York Times. Clay's new book is coming out very soon. It is called, Clay, go for it.
The Impossible Collection of Whiskey from Assaline.
And you can pre-order it now through the Assaline website and through various fine booksellers. We prefer you shop at your local bookstore compared to that big A place, but you shop where you feel best and support your local bookseller if you possibly can. Nino Marchetti of thewhiskeywash.com with news updates all week long. Put it this way, if I can't recommend my own site to you for whiskey news, I'm recommending Nino's.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you both for this. Stick with me for just a second here while I say goodbye to everyone. Don't forget to join us on your favorite podcast app for this week's Whiskey webcast, WhiskyCast podcast, rather. We will be talking with Julie Trevisan Hunter of the Scotch Whisky Exchange about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Scotch whisky tourism. The Scotch Whisky Experience will be opening up on August 17th, and we are starting to see more distilleries opening up now. So we'll be talking with her. There's been a multi-million-pound impact. It's safe to say no one quite knows for sure just how much, based on visitor centers having to be closed for most of the summer so far, and distilleries trying to salvage what they can. We send our thoughts out to the folks at the McAllen and Highland Park. As Clay mentioned, Edrington announced plans to lay off some of their visitor centers employees this month. Those centers will not reopen until September at the earliest. So we send our thoughts out to those folks and also to everyone suffering from COVID-19, their relatives and the families, and everyone who's trying to cope with this, especially with the economic impacts as well, too. Don't forget to join us next Wednesday for the Whiskey Wednesday webcast. We'll be talking with Orland Sorensen and Brett Carlisle of Woodinville Distillery in Washington State. They're making some really cool whiskeys, have won a bunch of awards going on so far this year, so we'll be talking with them as well. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend. Be safe. Wear your masks, kids, when you're out in public. Hey, you may not like it. I don't like it either, but if I can put this thing on and knock my glasses off and still say goodbye to you guys, you can wear a freaking mask for a few minutes out in public. So be safe, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.